Hi, and welcome to the Fortify Your Brain Summit. I'm Betsy Schroeder, your host, and today I have as my guest Bradley Busch. And Bradley is a chartered psychologist and director of the mindset coaching company InnerDrive. He graduated from Loughborough University with a distinction and went on to work with premiership and international footballers from England, Scotland, Wales, and Japan. Outside of football, he has worked with elite athletes, helping GB athletes win medals at the London 2012 and Rio 2016 Games. As well as writing regularly for The Guardian, he is a leading expert on how psychological research can best help students, teachers, athletes, and businesses think and perform better. Welcome, Brad.
Welcome. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. So share a little bit more about your background and then what you do at the mindset coaching company InnerDrive.
Sure. So, as you mentioned, my background's in sport, working with athletes, mainly footballers, around how do they improve mindset, resilience, and also ability to perform under pressure. And for about the last 10 years, I've also been working in both education and business. So applying those same sort of concepts for students around how can they perform the best in their exams, and in businesses, how do people develop the habits and strategies that allow them to perform at their best consistently?
Oh, wow, excellent. We all need that. So a large part of what you do at InnerDrive is around something called metacognition, growth mindset, and then of course stress management. So can you talk especially about metacognition? I don't know if many of us have heard of that before, and then also the growth mindset and what those two terms mean.
Sure. So metacognition is a very popular concept, especially in education. And in layman's terms, it revolves around being aware of how we think. So that means helping ourselves choose the right strategy for the various tasks that we do. And it also includes managing our emotions. So a classic example is when you're really, really angry, like 10 out of 10 angry, you're so consumed by that emotion that in that moment you don't often know you're angry, you're just acting out of impulse. So part of what metacognition does is it looks to how can we better control our emotions by becoming aware of, say, triggers that often make us stressed or nervous, and then do we know which strategies to use to help us then feel, depending on what we need, more confident, less nervous, less stressed. So it's it's about really self-awareness and self-reflection, and then choosing helpful thought processes.
Okay. And so what about the growth mindset?
Yeah, so growth mindset, I guess, is a part, the two are fairly linked. Growth mindset, very popular in education, but also now in sport and business, refers basically to this concept of how do we view our own abilities. So take any particular task, be it singing, home improvement, how good you are at your job, any sort of area or domain, is do you think your abilities are relatively fixed? If you view them as set in stone, I am who I am, I'm not a maths person, I'll never be good at DIY, those sort of things are very self-contained. Whereas the flip side of that, a growth mindset, is the belief that our ability can improve. So through either hard work or learning from our mistakes or seeking out good feedback, you kind of believe that yesterday's failure doesn't have to be fatal. It's not the end of the world because you can adapt and get better. And there's a good amount of evidence that suggests how we view our own abilities, either fixed or growth, have a big impact for how we think, feel, and behave. So if we take the current example at the moment of the kind of the new normal we're all living in with coronavirus, a fixed mindset would find change in new situations really stressful because you're worried that you don't have the set abilities needed to cope with this new, say, digital world that lots of people have to shift to. Whereas if you have a growth mindset, you might take the attitude of, I don't have those abilities at the moment, but I believe I can learn them. And so transition and change are a lot less stressful and therefore improves both motivation and performance. And these are sort of thought processes that we can help people develop. So it's not something you either have or you don't. You can learn these sort of thought processes.
Yeah. So beyond the coronavirus situation, what other impact can having like a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset have on our lives, like in sports and business, in the school, like you're talking about?
Yeah, well, it crosses over all areas. So take an area such as feedback. Most people, they say they want feedback, but actually what they really want is praise.
Yeah.
Uh, and therefore, when they actually get genuine feedback, in their mind, that's the opposite of praise, which is therefore criticism. And then they take it very personally, and that we see some people get quite defensive, and they spend more time arguing why that feedback's wrong as opposed to actioning that feedback. Whereas if you have a growth mindset, if you believe you can improve, feedback is actually really valuable. It's kind of the way to get better. And so it changes the whole relationship we have with feedback in terms of people tend to seek it out more, they tend to value it, they tend to care less about how other people are necessarily doing as a benchmark, but more comparing themselves to themselves. And that over time leads to more resilience because it's a more robust form of motivation. You're not relying on anyone else to give you the motivation, it comes from within.
Yeah, makes sense. So, you work with athletes, especially really high level athletes. How does mindset help them get from like, they're really great, but now they get up to the next level? Like what's kind of an example of how you're coaching them and then what are the results?
I guess one of the quite interesting thing about sport, and this is true especially for elite athletes, but for all level of competition and all level of athlete, is often when you're performing, you have to perform at a high level because sport's very results orientated, and so people care if you win or you lose quite a lot.
Yeah.
But you also have to make sure you're learning at the same time, and so finding that balance between performance and learning is quite difficult because learning to an extent relies on risk taking, making mistakes, probably stretching yourself. Like that's the only way we really learn is kind of through trial and error. But yet when you have to perform consistently at a high level, there's not much wiggle room for trial and error because too much error can cost you your career, your livelihood, your place in the team.
Yeah.
So having a growth mindset is quite key in that respect of how do I balance the need for short-term performance, but also I need to make sure that I'm learning as much as possible. And so part of that means you can't just get obsessed with the outcome because in sport, outcome can be quite random. You can play badly and win, and you can play well and lose. So growth mindset would encourage someone to reflect more on their processes and their behaviors. So quite basic questions, but are quite powerful, such as what did I do well? What could I have done differently? What am I going to work on in training? All of those things still have an element of high performance around them, but place an emphasis on learning at the same time. And that's often what's quite key, I think, to really help people make the step up in elite sport because the margins are so fine. And so anything you can do to try and give yourself that 1 or 2 extra percent could make all the difference.
Oh, absolutely. So how, like, I guess what's kind of like an example of working with someone, and like what you talk through things that maybe are going well or things that aren't, and then you're kind of refining.
Yeah, I think so. Having kind of a learning mindset is kind of at the heart of it. If we like take sport as the example, a lot of athletes will have a lot of goals that are based on numbers. Like I want to score 20 goals. I want to make 50 points in this game. And that's obviously important. But I think where mindset kind of comes into it is it acknowledges the importance of those targets, but puts more an emphasis on the behaviors needed to achieve it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's called being quite process focused. And that's because outcome inevitably follows process. So by doing your processes, it doesn't guarantee you achieve the outcome, but by just focusing on outcome alone, you almost take your eye off the ball of what you need to do in order to how to achieve it. So it's often about identifying what do you need to do, like what are your key performance indicators, or what do you need to do in order to have a good performance. And if you do those things, the outcome should take care of itself.
I
Whereas with the immediacy of sports, sometimes it's very easy just to get focused on just the outcome and ignore what you need to do in order to get there. And that's often where a sports psychologist can help just by asking those sort of questions and prompting those sort of conversations, because often they don't happen with the immediacy of the results.
Yeah, and I can see how that translates into business as well, focusing on results versus the process, right?
Oh, and business is like the parallels of sport shouldn't be underestimated in terms of lots of data, lots of pressure of next quarter or next result. Short termism is quite high. And yet long term, people who learn do better. So finding that balance in business is often key, because people's livelihoods and their jobs depend on meeting certain targets. But if you only go from target to target and forget about the process and behaviors needed to achieve them, you're almost always playing catch up, and it's really stressful. Whereas having a longer term view while still hitting short term targets is the balancing act that is needed.
Wow, makes sense. That's great. So, what, like, if we're just starting thinking about this whole growth mindset, and we're dealing with all that's going on in the world right now with coronavirus and shutdowns and all that kind of thing, how can we start to develop that growth mindset? What are the changes that need to take place there? What are we needing to focus on?
Well, I guess as a starting point, and it's, I guess, relevant to Corona, but true in terms of all pressurized situations, is in almost less emphasis needs to be placed on the situation. Like when people focus too much on their current situation, it's really easy to kind of go into this blame game culture, or complain about things not being fair, or why is this happening to me? Whereas when the emphasis is all more about what do I need to do next, or how can I improve the situation, it's kind of putting that internal focus of control over the situation might be quite bad, but what's my next step, as opposed to just complaining about the situation.
Mm-hmm.
That sort of focus is often a good starting point. I think we've seen that a lot with Corona, is almost overnight, through no real fault of their own, many businesses went from facing potentially some of their best years this year to being quite stressful, invoicing stopping, hard to deliver services, and yet it's not their fault. So the question then needs to be, if it's not my fault, I can accept that, but while also having the flexibility of thinking, so what am I going to do now? What's my next step? Because if you kind of get into this blame game culture, if you kind of always focus on things being unfair, you end up just having the equivalent of like a pity party, and feel like you get to complain about it, and you might feel good complaining, but it doesn't actually get you any nearer where you want to go. So it's been quite solution focused. It's focusing on actions and behaviors, as opposed to randomness and chance and bad luck.
Right. Okay. So, like, where would you start? Like, you start kind of gathering information. You make a list. You decide what you need to learn to adapt.
Yeah, I mean, I think it probably comes, cliche as it might sound, but true as it is. It starts by, I guess, as a company or an individual, deciding what your mission statement is, what your values are. So taking my company as an example, we run training conferences and presentations, but that's not actually what the company's mission statement is. Like, that's the vehicle that we have done it with pre-corona, but our mission statement is to help people learn and improve. And when you focus on that, then you kind of go, well, how does that then apply to this situation? And it might be, okay, so we'll have to do a lot of stuff online training then.
Mm-hmm.
But by starting with those values and that mission statement, it allows you to adapt easier, because you know what matters to you. You kind of have that sense of purpose. Whereas if you mistakenly think that your company is, we deliver presentations and conferences, then that gets stressful, because you can't do that in the present climate. So yeah, it's about kind of working, I guess, starting with what's your core purpose? How do you best service your clients? What matters to you? How can you make a positive impact in the world? And then working out where that fits in the current situation is probably going to be far more productive than trying to force the old way of doing things, because the situation simply doesn't allow for it.
Yeah, absolutely. How are you adapting then? I mean, you're going more online, and I know you work with schools as well. So how is that looking in the UK for, I don't know?
So we spent pretty much the first month of lockdown. We kind of decided the problem with online, well, there's like several, but I guess the first is there's a lot of misinformation out there. Everyone can self-publish. It's really easy to get from myths to grow online. So the first thing we did was publish a whole series of free lockdown packs for educators on here's what you can do during this time, just to get good information out there, because first and foremost, we were there to service our community. And so we spent the first month doing that. And then we spent a lot of time looking at, the second thing is the issue with online is most online training, for example, is terrible. Like, if it's just a recording of a PowerPoint, that's incredibly dull. And no one wants to sit through that, and everyone's on their phones and doing a million other jobs at the same time. It's not particularly interactive. It's not engaging. And so then how do you overcome those hurdles? And so we've spent quite a bit of time looking at various platforms and softwares that allow for interaction, a good hybrid of pre-recorded, so it can be done at people's convenience, which I think is quite important during Corona, now that most people, especially if you have children, working from home is a particular challenge, whilst also getting that interactive feel that live sessions have had. So I think it's quite important in general, and what we did is we tried not to rush in. It's kind of, I guess, like a game of chess, like your first few moves matter the most. And I think the temptation sometimes when people experience change is to panic. And when you panic, people underestimate how much time they have, they rush in, and it leads to quite sloppy mistakes. So I think just taking some time to assess the situation and plot your moves and work out how do you best service your user base, your clients, is the most important part, because then the solutions become obvious. Whereas when you start first with, this is how I think we should do it, you're trying to mash things together that don't quite fit.
Yeah, and under pressure too, and then it kind of shuts down your thinking, right?
For sure.
Yeah. So you've written a couple of books on this. Can you talk a little bit about them? I know one's on how we learn, and then
So we've got a couple books out. Our first one was called Release Your Inner Drive, which was very much aimed at the teenage student market. The running joke is that I wanted to write like a full-on PhD thesis, and my business partner wanted to write a comic book. So we tried to combine the two, essentially, for students. And our second book, called The Science of Learning, is aimed more at teachers. And that is very much looking at, it's really hard to read good research if you're non-academic, because often they're behind paywalls, you don't know where to search for them, and they're actually not written for the public. They're often written for fellow psychologists. So we wanted to make it accessible and easy to digest and kind of just headline findings. So we found 77 studies that we think everyone should know, that range from how do you overcome procrastination? Should you work while listening to music? What impact does sleep and mobile phones have on learning? Just kind of every topic around learning, and summarize the main findings of that. We have a couple more versions coming out soon. So we've got our second edition of that's coming out. And then towards the end of the year, our parent version is coming out, because as a young parent myself, I've only realized now, having had a child, everyone's just guessing. Like, no one knows what to do. And it's just a case of, if I don't believe research has all the answers, but if it can just point us in the right direction, that's like gold dust to a parent, I think. So trying to look at what can parents do to help their children learn is essentially the core part of that.
Okay. Yeah, did you want to highlight a couple of things from research about, how we learn and what that, how our growth mindset can affect our success?
I mean, there's a couple of studies that I always find quite interesting. The ones on what people do wrong, I think, are always quite fascinating. So one of my favorite research papers looked at different ways people tend to learn and study, and then went through all the existing research on those strategies to kind of measure how effective they are. And it found two of the most popular strategies that people use, which is to reread your notes over and over again to try and ingrain them into your memory. and highlighting key passages. Those two really popular strategies are two of the least effective and probably worst strategies that people can use, because essentially they can be done on autopilot. And if you don't have to think hard about something, you tend not to remember it, where all the really hard stuff that people don't like doing is often the best way to learn. So stuff like quizzing and doing tests and past papers is really effective for learning, because you have to think hard about it. You can't do it on autopilot. And so the act of having to recall an answer actually strengthens our memory. So it turns out most people get studying the wrong way around. Most people think you do lots of studying and then you do a quiz at the end to see how much you've learned. Whereas actually you should do quizzing to do your learning. They don't actually just measure learning, they actually accelerate it as well. So I find that sort of research quite interesting. The one about should people listen to music when they're working is really interesting for me. I should say music is obviously really good for mood. It's really good for motivation, which is why people listen to it at the gym. But when it comes to actually learning, all the evidence suggests that people who study whilst listening to music that has lyrics almost always do worse, even if they like the music, because it gets stuck in their head, basically the words of the songs. But we don't want music to be stuck in people's head. We want the learning to be stuck in their head. So I find that quite interesting. Mobile phones, I think, is quite a bugbear of mine. There's some evidence to suggest that if you have your phone out on the table in front of you during a meeting, even if you're not using your phone, but it's in sight, people tend to perform about 20% worse on concentration tests. Literally out of sight is out of mind for that. So I find that sort of stuff quite interesting. I guess the other study that I'd point people towards, there's a pair of researchers in England. They're pretty much the leading resilience researchers in the country. And one of their recent papers looked at what can we do to create an environment that can help other people's resilience flourish within that environment. So if you're a teacher, how do you create a resilient classroom? If you're working business and you run a team, what can you do to help your team become more resilient? And it turns out there's many strategies, but one of the things they point out is two factors you need to really be aware of. One is what they call having high levels of challenge. So that means setting the bar high, pushing people to do more than they have done previously, lofty goals, not resting on our laurels, high levels of challenge and demand. But then that combines with, they say, high levels of support. So people need to feel that they're part of their team, that they're connected, they're not isolated. And you can't have a resilient environment without both. If you have high challenge but low support, it tends to lead to burnout. Whereas if you have low levels of challenge but really supportive, like that's really nice and it's lovely and it's comfortable, but it doesn't really induce high performance. And I quite like that, because I might not be able to control or even really impact who my team are some of the time, but I can set the tone for culture and environment and ethos. And that, it turns out, has a big impact on resilience and mindset as well.
Wow. Yeah, that's really interesting. And that kind of explains like sports teams. It seems like there's a high level of both support and like challenging to do better all the time.
Yeah, and it's interesting. So I don't know if you have the same thing over there, but we certainly have it in the UK. There's been a few high-profile sports where they've tried to raise the bar in terms of expectations of their athletes, and the level of challenge has increased. But because the level of support hasn't, it's led to quite a lot of athletes having mental health issues or anxiety, because you really do, like, performance and well-being aren't separate. They're very much entwined. And we need to make sure the people we work with have both, and that we help them develop both. So resilience, often some people see resilience as the opposite of well-being. It's like, can you grit and bear it and not complain? And that's what being resilient means. Whereas actually resilience often means being comfortable asking for help and support is one of the hallmarks of a resilient performer. So yeah, having both those elements of challenge and support, really important.
Yeah, it sounds like they have to be in balance. So yeah, okay, that makes sense. Wow. Okay. Well, thank you for all of that. That was really fascinating. Um, is there anything else that you would like to share particularly?
Oh, I don't know. One of them probably, one thing I find quite interesting actually at the moment, I was talking to a colleague about this, is people often want new or like groundbreaking ways of improving resilience, motivation, mindset, and they often neglect the obvious stuff. And so like things like sleep are so fundamental. If you could prescribe a drug that did what sleep did, people would have it so much because it improves your memory, your concentration, your well-being, your ability to handle stress. And yet it's one of the things that often gets sacrificed. And I think like the average human spends over 20 years of their life asleep, but most people don't really know how to get good sleep or what common sleep mistakes there are. And so I find that area, if you're serious about performance, it's very hard to fulfill your potential if you neglect stuff like sleep. Breakfast is probably another one. Like common sense, obvious, basic stuff. It's fascinating how often that side of things gets neglected.
Yeah.
While people chase the glamorous side of like strategies instead.
Right. Do you have any tips for sleep or?
Okay, yeah, we can do a few. So there's a thing called the pillow test. They say if you fall asleep within 5 minutes of your head hitting the pillow each night, you should go to bed earlier. Like you shouldn't be exhausted when you go to bed. That probably means that you need a bit more sleep. Mobile phones probably shouldn't be used for an hour before bed. If they are, they should be used on like a lower light setting because it suppresses the sleep hormone melatonin. Having regular bedtimes, exercising late afternoon, early evening almost certainly helps. TV, iPad, probably not a good idea the hour or two before bed. They often say you can predict someone's quality and quantity of sleep by what they do for the 2 hours before they go to bed. So actually like you want a good run-in of being like gradually getting more calm and more relaxed as opposed to watching an action thriller and then going to bed straight away. For teenagers especially, as a rough rule of thumb, like this isn't a hard fact, but as a rough anecdotal evidence rule of thumb, for each electrical item that's in their room that isn't a light, so like a phone, a PlayStation, an Xbox, whatever, you can probably minus 1 hour of sleep for each electrical item. Because so like if a child has a TV and an iPad in his room, I'd expect them to get 2 hours less than a child who doesn't have a TV and an iPad in their room, because our ability to self-regulate and not give in to temptation, generally speaking, gets better as we get older. And as a teenager, you have the world of distractions at your fingertips, and simply our brain hasn't finished developing, so you don't have the impulse control to not engage in those things. Right. So yeah, I think those are good starting points for sleep.
Wow. Excellent. So what are some things that you do on a regular basis to sort of fortify your brain against the stress and stay healthy?
I think physical activity, I think exercise shouldn't be underestimated. Mm-hmm. Not only because of the physical benefits to it, but psychologically, the well-being benefits of exercise are significant. I think there's generally a concept that teams are much stronger than individuals, and people often try to take on too much themselves, but that's something I find delegating quite difficult, especially if you have high standards for your own work. But it's important because, you know, there's this old proverb of if you want to go fast, go by yourself, but if you want to go far, go together. So like, it's very hard to achieve what you want without a team around you. And that team doesn't necessarily just have to be a business team. It could be emotional support from family and friends. And I think one of the biggest challenges, I guess, in terms of fortifying your brain at the moment is there's no compartmentalization now of work and home life for a lot of people. Like, right. You're on 24/7. You check your work emails in front of the TV at 9 o'clock at night, but yet that email probably could wait till first thing in the morning in most cases. So having some degree of separation and working out what that looks like for you shouldn't be underestimated.
Yeah, makes sense. So where can people find you online and find out more about what you do, find your books, etc.?
Sure. So our website is www.innerdrive.co.uk. We're on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook under InnerDrive. And we have a newsletter that basically every time we find an interesting research paper, we summarize it on how that finding can help improve your life. And that's on our newsletter. So you can sign up to that on our website.
All right. Thank you so much. Really appreciate
Absolute
your
pleasure.
time, all your expertise.
Absolute pleasure. It's been lovely talking.
Thank you.
Cheers.